Welcome to an introduction to Alteryx Designer. Now, Alteryx is a data toolset designed from the ground up to empower business and technology users alike in using their data more effectively. Alteryx means different things to different people depending on who you ask. For some, it's all about data acquisition and enrichment. However, others place much more emphasis on its predictive modeling, application developing, or even geospatial capabilities. Alteryx allows users to rapidly prepare, blend, conform, and analyze data from any source, including flat files, databases, APIs, and more within a single instance. All of this is accomplished using a visual workflow designer that you're seeing up on screen right now, and is remarkably intuitive and easy to use, requiring no code, but also code-friendly should you prefer. So let's get started. The Alteryx Designer window is split up into four main components. The first being this toolbar, which you're going to see atop the screen, which contains all of the tools that you're going to use and piece together to build what's called a workflow. Now, each tool, as you can see here, is split out by their shape and their color, depending on what sort of function they provide for us within the workflow. So we have our favorites palettes here, which is selected automatically, but you've also got tools that take data in and out of the workflow, tools that start to prepare that data. So you're going to see such tools as filtering, data cleansing, formulas here. You've also got a join category, parsing, transformation, and it just goes on and on. There's a whole host of different tools that we've got here in Alteryx, but I think just for the purposes of this introduction, we're just going to make use of these first 5 tool categories here, or even just the tools that are present within the favorites palette. Now, once you've found a tool that you're interested in using, quite typically this is in the first instance is the input data tool. Let's go ahead and click, drag, and place it onto where it says drop tools here, right in the middle. This is called the canvas, where you're going to build that workflow. Now, once I've dropped a tool onto the canvas, I can give it a click, and on the left hand side we're going to see what's called the configuration pane. Now, the configuration pane is where you tell precisely what you want this tool to do. This being an input data tool, I'm going to go ahead and point to the file in which I'm interested in reading to this workflow. So I'm going to click on this drop down menu here, pop open this data connections window, and head on over to files. So you can see here a list of all the supported file types. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it just shows you some of the files that we can read into Alteryx nice and easily. These contain such things as CSV files, JSON files, XML files, Excel files, you name it, it's all here. And if you're not seeing the data source which you're interested in reading into Alteryx from this screen, you can also go to data sources. Now, this is where we can hook ourselves up to the likes of Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle databases, Amazon databases, IBM databases, Hadoop, whatever you've got, we can make sure we can hook up to it. But I'm going to head back to files. I'm going to go ahead and select my file. It's going to pop open a Windows Explorer box here, and I'm just going to select the customers.csv file. Once I have that selected, I can click onto open, and it's going to go ahead and read that file into the input data tool. Now, next thing I'm going to do is head on back to my favorites toolbar here, find this tool called the browse tool. Give it a click, hold down my left mouse button and drag it onto the canvas until I see these dotted lines appear. These dotted lines, once I drop this browse tool onto the canvas, are going to transform into what's called a connection between these two tools. Now, if this connection isn't present, by maybe you dropping down this browse tool a little bit further away from the other input data tool, all you need to do is to hover over this green anchor or nose, some people like to call them, until you see this little hand icon appear. Now, if you click and hold your mouse, you can drag that connector and snap it into place into the input node of the browse tool. Now, if I zoom back out, this is in essence the smallest workflow you can build. Read in a file and go ahead and take a look at it. So let's click on to run to execute the flow. Now that the workflow is finished running, I can take a look at the fourth part of the designer window, that being the results pane. So I can see here the contents of the CSV file. Now I can click on any one of these fields. Let's take the customer segment field, for example. Now once I've got the browse tool selected, I can see here, rather than having the configuration pane for this tool present, it shows me what's called a data profile. And this allows you to take a little bit of a deeper dive into what this data set's all about. So I can see here how many values we've got as OK, how many are unique, how many are null, not okay, or empty. Now a lot of people say to me, hey, what's not okay mean? And that simply means if you've got any trailing or leading white space here, got any tabs, carriage returns, or new lines in your cells, then that's going to be highlighted right away as being a not okay value, and you can go ahead and prepare that data before you go ahead and do anything else with it. We've also got some other information here. We just get a value by count, so we can see how many values we've got in the different customer segments at a flash, rather than having to scour through our data set. So definitely recommended to drop down a browse tool when you're utilizing a brand new data set, just so you can have a look at what that's all about and note down any preparatory steps which you're going to need to do to get this data set into a good shape. So first thing I might want to do in this workflow would be to just remove some of these address parts for the particular report that I'm creating here, where I'd like to find out what the total spend per customer is and figure out what our top 10 customers are for each one of the customer segments. These address parts here are of no use to me. So what I'm going to do is going to drag this browse tool over to the right hand side slightly and find the next tool that I'm interested in using, that being the select tool. I'm going to click and drag this tool onto the connector between the input data tool and the browse tool. Once I do so, it's going to merge itself between those two tools, and I can see the select tools configuration appear here in the left hand side of the window. So what I can do is I can see all of the fields I've got here within my dataset, and simply just use these checkboxes to remove these fields from my dataset. Now just bear in mind that when we're deselecting these fields here in Alteryx, we're not updating or modifying that source file in any way, shape or form. So you can remove and play around this data set in confidence without corrupting the source data whatsoever. Now this field here called unknown is quite important, because if I select the input to my tool now, just so I can see the data set coming on through from the input data tool, I can see here that I don't actually have a field called unknown. But what that means is, if anyone else goes into this CSV file and adds in, let's say, another zip field, we have zip3 for some reason, then that is constituted as an unknown field. Now Alteryx saying here, having this checkbox enabled, do I want to read through any fields that are not directly referenced here into the workflow the next time it's run, should there be any, or should I say, hey, any unknown fields I don't want to come through, and I'll leave this checkbox deselected. So once I've got that configuration set up, again I'm going to run the flow, and now what you notice here is with the exception, of course, being the input data tools and maybe some of the endpoint tools, such as the browse tool here, most Alteryx tools have some sort of input and some sort of output depicted by these green icons either side the select tool that we've got up on screen here. So you can see that the input node or anchor is selected at the moment, and I can see the state of the data set before the configuration I've set for the select tool is applied. Now if I select the output to this tool by clicking on here, I can see what the effects that configuration has on the data set, and you can quite easily flick between the input and the output just to verify that the tool's done precisely what you're after. All looks pretty good to me, although what I have noticed here in the data type field is that all of my fields are coming through as a V string. Now there's only really three main data types I would say that you need to concern yourself when you're first getting into Alteryx, those being a string type data, which is this text based data. You've also got some numerical type data, If I click here on this type drop down, we can see the full list of these data types. Excuse me. So we have the string based data here. So these are all different text types data. We have int 16, 32 and 64. That simply stands for an integer, so that's a whole number rounded up to the nearest value. We also have a fixed decimal, which you can imagine is just a number rounded up to a certain number of decimal places. And then we have what's called a double, which is the exact figure, so no rounding taking place there. We then also have some date time and then date time data as well. So those string, numerical and date time data points are probably the only types you need to concern yourself in the first instance. But as I was saying, we can see that all of the data types for this data set here are coming through as a V string, so all as text. But if I take a look in the results pane, I can see that I've got two columns here, namely the customer ID and the store number fields. That should be numerical. So I could go ahead and manually update the data type by selecting them by this drop down in the select tool, or alternatively, in keeping with Alteryx fashion, we like to keep things as simple as possible. What I'm going to do is head on over to the preparation category and find this tool here called the auto field tool. Once I've found that tool, I'm going to click, drag and then place it onto the connector. And all I have to do here is select the fields on which I want the tool to go ahead and update the data type for me. Now this autofill tool, if I give this workflow a run, is going to scour through the fields that I had selected in the configuration pane and go ahead and update the data types to what Alteryx thinks is the best fit. So if I have a look here, I can see the input that's coming on in, and if I flick to the output, there's no apparent change. But what's happening here is we're actually updating what's called the metadata as opposed to the data itself. You're going to see here in the results grid I've got two tabs, one called data, which is selected now, highlighted in blue. I've also got one here for metadata. If I click onto that, I should be able to see the data types for all the fields coming into the tool. Notice how I've got the input node selected to this tool. Now if I flick to the output, after this autofill tool's configuration has been applied, I can see that the data types have been updated to a better fit. Alright, let's flick back to the data tab, and there's still a couple things I want to do with this data set before it's ready to go. Those being cleaning up this first and last name fields here. They're all capitalized, and I probably want to push them down to be title case. So again, going to find the tool that I'm interested in using. In this circumstance, it's going to be the data cleansing tool. I'm going to drag this onto the canvas, place it onto the line once again, and then configure the tool how I want it to work. So there's a variety of different cleansing options we can do utilizing this data cleansing tool, such as remove all null rows or null columns, should we have any. Very useful indeed. Or alternatively, we can just simply select the columns we'd like to cleanse. And in this example, it's just going to be the first name and the last name. Now we can replace null values here in string fields with blank value, or in a numerical field with the value of 0, but that's not relevant for us in this case, so I'll deselect those options. You also have the opportunity to remove any unwanted characters, such as leading, trailing whitespace, or tabs, line breaks, and duplicate whitespace. Now if you recall earlier on in the video, I mentioned in the data profile how we could have some not okay records that can be coming up and highlighted in red in the data profile from the browse tool. If you have any of those records, then this data cleansing tool and having these two options selected will clean that right up for you. But again, not useful in this circumstance, so I'm going to deselect those. What I'm most interested in is to modify the case. So I simply select this checkbox here, click onto the drop down menu and select the case that I'm interested in, that being the title case. Now again, I'm going to run the flow by clicking on this blue run button at the top right of the window. I'm going to have a look at the input to the data cleansing tool, seeing what that data looks like coming into the tool. Now if I flick to the output again, I'm going to see what the modify case action does, and I can see that the first and last name has been updated nicely. So I think this data set is good to go. Next thing I'm going to need to do is to drag in and read in the next input to my flow. So again, I'm going to zoom out a little bit and go back to my favorites palette and find the input data tool. Again, dragging another one of these down, I'm going to place it somewhere around here. So I'm going to give this a click in the same fashion I had done earlier. Go to my data connections window, files, select a file, and this time I'm going to select the transaction.xml. Okay, once I've got that selected, I can click onto open and drag down another browse tool and just place it somewhere around here. Cool. Once that's done, I'm going to give the workflow one more run. Okay, so clicking onto this browse tool, I can see now the contents of this XML file coming on through. So this has my customer ID in here, and it also has some of these sales values for the products that these customers have bought. Now, to tally up the total sales for each one of my customers, what I'm going to need to do is to join this transactions file here to the customers data set that I've got at the top. Before I can do so, however, I'm going to need to prepare this data again, ever so slightly. Now, if I flick to that metadata tab that I had a look at earlier, we can notice that all of the columns within our data set are coming through as text once again. Now, if I flick back to the data tab, I've certainly got some fields here that need to be in numerical values, such as the sales. If we're going to sum up the sales value for each one of our customer IDs, that needs to be numerical value, as we cannot sum up text, as you can imagine. So what I could do is drag down another auto field tool in the same fashion I had done in the above work stream. Or alternatively, as we had a look at, the select tool is great for updating any of these data types manually should you wish. So I could even select this sales field here, click on that drop down and say, hey, I want that to be a double data type, which is a numerical data type. Once that's done, I'm going to workflow one more run and we can take a look at the results. So if I flick to the metadata tab now, we should be able to see that all of my data types have been updated nice and neatly, and that's ready to go. Although there is one more step to be had before I can join to that customer data set, and that is of course to sum up all of these sales values. So what I'm going to do is drag this browse tool a little bit further to the right hand side, head on back to my favorites palette, and I'm going to find this tool here called the summarize tool. Now, you'll be able to notice, of course, by its shape and its color, that it's part of the transform category. But we'll just stick in the favorites palette just for now. Again, I'll find that tool, drag it onto the line, drop it there, and then on the left hand side we're going to configure the tool and tell it what we want it to do. So we want to first have one row per customer ID. So therefore I'm going to select my customer ID up here in the fields, add an action to it, and then do a group by. Next, what I'm going to do is select my sales column, add an action to that, and then sum it up. Now the output field name is going to be the name of the field that's going to be coming out of this tool. By default it's called sum sales, but I also have the opportunity here to give it a nice new name, and I'm going to call this total sales. Probably sounds a little bit better. Some other things I could do here are select the order ID field, add an action to that, and then count it. This could give me visibility on the number of orders that created that total sales figure. And I'll even go as far as selecting the product name, which we can see here, add an action, and there's a whole host of string specific or text specific actions that we've got here, and I can click onto concatenate, and this will give me a list of all of the products wrapped up together in a single cell. And of course you can choose how those values are separated down here, and maybe I want to have a slash separating those product names. Okay, once that's been configured, let's run the workflow once again. We can take a look at the data coming into the tool. So this is our view that we're familiar with thus far. Click onto the output, and we can see now that we've got one row per customer ID, a visibility of the total sales for that customer, how many orders they've made, and then if I double click here, we can see all of the products concatenated together onto a single line with that slash as the separator between the product names. Brilliant. Okay, so now I think we're in a good shape to join our customers data set here at the top to the transactional data set here, which we can see at the bottom. So before I do so, I'm going to get rid of these browse tool now by highlighting them both and then just selecting delete. They've kindly served their purpose for us now, and what we're going to do is join these two work streams together. As you can imagine, we're going to be using the join tool, so I can find that up here in the favorites palette again. Click, drag, and I'm going to place it somewhere along here. Now this join tool looks a little different than some of the other tools that we've been working with thus far, just because it's got 2 inputs and 3 outputs. They are labeled L and R, these inputs, which simply just stand for left and for right. So we can take our customers data set up here, coming out of the data cleansing tool, click, drag, and place that into the left hand side. And similarly, we're going to do the same for the transactional data set by clicking, dragging, and placing it into the right hand side. Now, once I've got these 2 data sets connected to one another in this join tool, as we can see here in the configuration, now I'm going to have to tell these Alteryx how I'm going to join these 2 tables together. And that being, of course, with our customer ID field. So I can join by specific fields, click on the left, and I'll select my customer ID. And similarly, I can click on the right drop down and select my customer ID here. Now I can see here in the configuration of the join tool, I've got a view very similar to that of the select tool that we used earlier on in the flow, but with one addition, this column here called input. So if the records from these 2 data sets are successfully joined together, I can see which fields are going to come from the left hand side, that being our customers file, and which field is going to come from our right hand side, that's the transactional file. I can even have the opportunity to use these directional buttons here to kind of push these transactional file records a little bit further up into my table. Of course, the further up they are in this view, the further left they will be in our data set. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is just to right click onto this join tool and select the option here to add all browsers. And what that's going to do, as you can see, is add a browse tool to every one of these 3 outputs that we've got here. Next thing I'm going to do, just before I run the flow, is just click onto a blank space on this workflow, just about here, and that's going to bring up the general workflow configuration. And I'm interested in this option here called connection progress. Now, by default, that's selected as only show when running, but I want to say show all the time, and the reason for that will become apparent in just a second, because once that option has been selected, then these little boxes between the connectors, between the tools, are going to appear on the flow and be present all the time. Now this shows me the record count between each one of the tools as we're going along, and this is especially useful when we're using a join tool. So if I run the flow, it shall illustrate my point nicely. So I can see here, having these connection progress boxes showing all the time now, I can see coming in from my customers file, I have 2,678 records coming into the left hand side, 2,703 records coming in from the right hand side, that's our transaction file, and I can see here I've got my 3 outputs labeled L, J and R. L stands for left, R stands for right, and J stands for join. So out of the J for join output in the middle here, I can see that I've got 2,678 records joined. That's great. That's all of my customer records. And I can confirm this by looking at the left output here, which will show me all of the left-hand records that do not join to the right-hand records. This being 0 records here, so I can say that confidently my customer records have all joined to the transactional side. But as we can see here, and the reason being why I've added these browse tools to the outside of the join tool, is I can see here on the right output, I actually have 25 records coming out of this output. So that means I've got 25 records from my transactional data set that are not joining up to my customers data set. Now this might be okay in some examples, or in other examples this could not be acceptable. But just for the purposes of this demonstration, what I'm going to do is just use this J output and pretend we've got everything joined up just like we need it to. So now what we can do is we can see that we've got a customer ID field here alongside all of the transactional based data and then the customers data all in the same data set. That's great news. Now what I can do here is start to formulate my output. So I'm just going to get rid of these browse tools on the left and the right output for the time being, and just drag this tool a little bit further over to the right hand side. Now what I want to do is create a report that shows the top 10 customers by that total sales figure for each one of the customer segments that I've got here. So first thing you need to do is to sort my data in descending order by that total sales, because of course I'll have my best customers at the top of my table. So I'm going to drag this sort tool from the favorites palette, place it onto that line, and on the left hand side here I can select the field I'd like to sort by, that being my total sales, and then the order it needs to be sorted by, and that is descending. Again, give that a run. Now if I take a look at the browse tool I've got here, the end of my flow, I should see here my customer ID with the ID 3075 has spent £123,000 with us. So that's a tremendous amount, and we of course want to make sure we nurture that client. So now I've got my top customers at the top here. All I need to do here is now group by this customer segment, and I can do that by selecting this sample tool. So I drag it on, place it off the sort tool that I've got here on the canvas. I can say that I want to select the first n rows up here where the variable n is set to 10. So therefore first 10 rows. And I can group that by the customer segment field. Now if I give this a run, I know that I've got 4 customer segments, so therefore I should have 40, selecting the first 10 per customer segment, coming out of the tool. So I can see here that I've got the top 10 for consumer, then for corporates, then for home office, and then finally small business. That's great. So I guess the final step that I need to do here is output this prepared data set into an Excel workbook so that other people around the business can begin to use this output. So what I'm going to do is just delete this browse tool now and put in its place this tool here, the output data tool. So go ahead and drag that onto the flow and connect it up to the sample tool. And in the same fashion where I first selected to read in a file using the input data tool, what I'm going to do here now is select where I want to push or to write the file to. So I can select the file here, and then of course navigate to the area in which you would like to write the file. I'm just going to write it to this folder here. Do make sure you select the correct save as type in this drop down menu here. I'm going to leave it as the default Microsoft Excel. I'm just going to call this Alteryx demo out, like so. Give that a save, and it's going to ask you what you'd like to call the sheet. I'm going to leave it called sheet 1 for the time being. I'm going to change this output option here to overwrite sheet or range. Now if I run this workflow, I can see now here in the results grid I've got a log of everything that's happened during the flow, and I can see here the output data tool has written 40 records to this file, and I can click onto this link and it's going to pop open the Excel file for me to take a look at. Now if I just reorganize these columns, this is now the output of the Alteryx flow, and then people around the business can then start to use and consume this data set as they please. So if I close this file down and we just take a zoom out at everything we've done here in this Alteryx flow, all we've done is read in 2 files, that may be from source system A, from source system B, prepared that data, joined it together, and then output the results. Now if we're doing this in the traditional manual sense, let's think someone may have to go into source system A to export a customers.csv file, maybe go into another system, that being source B, and downloading this transactions XML document. Probably have to open them both up into Excel in parallel with one another, copy some data across from one sheet to another, do a pivot table to get the summary of the total spend for each one of the customer IDs, and maybe do a VLOOKUP here to join the values together, sort them, and then figure out what the top 10 customers were for each one of the customer segments. That could take maybe even a skilled analyst about half an hour, 45 minutes, maybe even up to an hour to complete manually. And of course, if they're doing that manually, then that does have the opportunity to introduce any human error. If they don't apply the correct formula or do the VLOOKUP correctly, then we could introduce errors unwittingly into that process. Now, since we've got this built out in Alteryx Designer, as you can see here, all these tools are laid out doing exactly the same steps as we would do manually, but when we run this flow, we're not going to deviate from these steps whatsoever. So we can be confident that every time we run this flow, we're going to get exactly the same output. And of course, running it within Alteryx is tremendously faster than doing it manually. And say, rather than taking between half an hour to an hour to complete such a process, if I take a look at the results grid, we've done this in just over 1 second. That's 1.3 seconds. So that's the sort of time efficiency and savings that we're looking to introduce to your team by utilizing Alteryx Designer. If you are interested in learning any more about Alteryx Designer, then visit our website, continuum.je, or reach out to us at inquiries@continuum.je, and it'd be our pleasure to show you a little bit more about Alteryx and answer any questions that you do have. Thanks for listening.